Welcome back. Time is almost 8:45. Flares were seen over the Gaza Strip last night after fighting resumed in the Middle East. Israel launched surprise airstrikes yesterday, shattering a ceasefire that's been in place since January. At least 400 people were killed in the strikes. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered the strikes after Hamas refused demands to free half of the remaining hostages. Israel says it will continue its attack in Gaza until Hamas is destroyed and all hostages are freed.
Meanwhile, people in Israel are now worried that they may never see their loved ones who are being held hostage by Hamas. Hundreds of people took to the streets of Tel Aviv yesterday, protesting Israel's resumed bombing of Gaza. Israel says yesterday's strikes were carried out because Hamas dragged its feet, moving into the next phase of the ceasefire. 2 weeks ago, Israel cut off supplies to Gaza and they cut off electricity to a plant that turns salt water into fresh water. This latest round of airstrikes has prompted a new wave of evacuation orders in Gaza, and many Palestinians are leaving for their own safety.
Joining us now for more insight on all of this, Nathan Bobbitt, professor of peace and war and political science at UNC Chapel Hill. Professor, thank you for joining us. I want to get right into this and catch people up to speed because it's been a lot for people to try to digest. For many people, the last they heard was there was a ceasefire in place. They were trying to get into stage 2. And then everything unraveled. How do we get here?
Right. So the process is it's been a difficult road since the initial ceasefire. So the ceasefire was agreed to. There were some exchanges of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for hostages. Both sides have accused the other one of not complying completely. From the Palestinian side, or Hamas's side, they've accused Israel of engaging in strikes despite the fact that there's a ceasefire. And from the Israeli side, they've accused the Hamas of, in a sense, not showing up on one occasion and also not complying completely in terms of the release of the prisoners. So the prisoners were released, but it's the sort of circumstances as to how they were released that were potential problems. So there are issues in sort of the ceasefire to begin with. One of the key issues is how it was supposed to proceed. So the first phase was the prisoner exchange. The second phase was supposed to be a demilitarization of Gaza and an exchange for all of the prisoners. And the problem with that is that if Hamas hands over all of the prisoners, they've given up all of their leverage and all protection that they potentially have. So they would expect that Israel would then attack them with impunity, where from Israel's perspective, if they withdraw, they have these security concerns that they're concerned that Hamas might regroup and might attack again. So that was really a problematic stage to begin with. It was going to be difficult. And I think now we're seeing that it's not quite holding.
We heard from Netanyahu yesterday, Navin, say, quote, "This is only the beginning." And so if we know about 400 or more died just yesterday from these attacks, I mean, it can't help but make you a little bit nervous. What else? What other cards can still be played? We know that Netanyahu wants Hamas destroyed. What is that going to look like?
Right, and it's unclear what that does look like, honestly, because I think one of the tragedies of yesterday was that because of the ceasefire, you saw Palestinians going back to their homes and moving more back to the sort of the urban areas, and now this attack happened, and now they're in jeopardy again. And so again, we saw it was a very bloody day yesterday. So that's deeply concerning. I don't know what more the IDF is planning on doing, though they have incredible capabilities and they can inflict quite a bit of damage on Gaza. And frankly, they own the sky, right? Gaza has no ability to defend itself from air attacks. If Israel continues to push this, Gaza's in for a very difficult road.
Nathan, we talked about it there. The hostages being in Hamas's control allows them to have a bargaining chip and ensures their safety against Israel. But Israel saying, one, as Jason just said, we want Hamas completely destroyed and we want our hostages all back. What can bring these two sides back to the negotiating table? Because it seems we're between a rock and a hard place.
So I agree with that. I think part of the issue is that Netanyahu and Israel have contradictory objectives. On one hand, if you want the hostages released, you need Hamas to deliver them. On the other hand, if you're promising that you're going to destroy Hamas in its entirety, Hamas has no reason to hand over those hostages. So those, since that's in contradiction. And again, what we saw is when the ceasefire was initially agreed to, Netanyahu lost some of his support from some rightist groups or from rightist parties within his coalition. Once hostilities started again, they joined again. So again, that illustrates the tension that Netanyahu's under as far as trying to balance these two things. So I think they have to make a choice. I mean, it looks like the choice that they're pursuing is they want to eliminate Hamas. And I don't know what that ultimately looks like because Hamas took over a year of fighting, and they're still there, right? So it's not clear what ultimately the elimination of Hamas might actually look like.
President Trump is currently working on a ceasefire deal with Russia and Ukraine. It sounds like President Trump is backing what Netanyahu is doing to destroy Hamas. How important is that relationship as our ally with Israel, that relationship with the U.S. and what is now happening again?
It's essential. I don't think Israel could do this without Trump support or without U.S. support. Israel needs U.S. support. It needs the continued weapon supply. It needs the cover that the United States provides it in the United Nations. So the U.S. is an indispensable ally, and I don't think this happens without U.S. support. Even if we look at the breakdown of the ceasefire, part of the reason was that the United States under Steve Witkoff proposed an alternative plan to what the ceasefire initially looked like, and Hamas rejected any revisions, and that led us to where we are.
Nathan, one of the interesting things that happens in the Middle East, everything's always connected when you talk about these foreign relations. We know that the United States is increasing their attacks against the Houthis, and we know that they were backed by Iran. Now that there is a negotiation between Trump and Iran possibly happening there, is that going to kind of remove any support for Hamas as they kind of lose their negotiating stick in terms of a support with Iran and then helping that with Trump?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the issues with just generally with state support for militant groups is that the support is observable to only some extent, but it typically is not completely observable, right? So even if hypothetically the Trump administration were to strike a deal with Iran, one of the problems is that it would not be able to fully identify if Iran is complying as far as its assistance to Hamas or the Houthi. So that's always going to be some potential issue, and that's something that has to sort of be taken on faith to some extent, and so it's not really verifiable. And I don't think the Trump administration, although they may want a deal, I don't think that Iran would necessarily give up support of the Houthi, especially because Iran has denied ever supporting the Houthi, which I think is fairly incredulous.
Nathan, quickly, could this start up again of this conflict in the Middle East create, I guess, ongoing tensions, anti-racism, anti-Palestinian racism, even in America? Could we see some of that ramp back up with this?
I think so. I mean, we did see it before in the initial stages. And I'll say generally, if we looked after 9/11 or after major episodes of terrorism that affect the U.S. or its allies, we tend to see that. So yes, I do think that that is a possibility, and that is something to be concerned about. One thing I can say in the initial stages of the war on terror that I certainly appreciate President Bush doing was that he visited a mosque and said this is not the responsibility of all Muslims. So there was an effort to sort of separate, in that case, Al-Qaeda from all Muslims. So the more that's done, the better, because Hamas does not represent all Muslims for sure.
All right, Nathan Boppett with UNC Chapel Hill professor of War and Peace, an expert on these Middle East relations. Thank you, as always, for your insight this morning.
Thank you.